Hello everyone. The following presentation is a brief summary and analysis of Chapter 3 of Athol Fugard's novel Tsotsi. Leaving Suki's shebeen, Tsotsi passes Rosie outside after her assault, but he ignores her. Boston's words keep playing in his mind. Tsotsi watches a house party across the street and sees two girls running from the house because they are being chased by a drunk man. Tsotsi almost manages to focus on the moment, but the drunk man falls in a way that reminds him of Boston on the floor of Suki's shebeen. At this stage, everything he sees and hears reminds him of Boston's warning words. In a blind panic, he runs into the darkness beyond the border of the township. He runs until he is physically exhausted to try and escape Boston's words. Tsotsi finds himself near the white suburbs. He physically tries to block Boston's words out by covering his ears with his hands. Tsotsi keeps moving mindlessly through the streets of the white neighborhood, ignoring the shower of rain that is falling from the sky, until he reaches a grove of blue gum trees where he can conceal himself, rest, and dismiss the thoughts of Boston from his mind. Tsotsi reflects on how Boston came into his life and into the gang. His thoughts reveal that he picked his gang members specifically because each member had a virtue. He had picked Boston because he had a virtue, just as the Arp had a virtue, which was strength, inhuman strength, and Butcher with his virtue, which was the accuracy that had earned him his name, an accuracy as reliable as the edge of a good knife. Boston's virtue being that he was clever. Boston had the foresight to spot the subtle flaws in a criminal plan that could ultimately lead to the gang's arrest, a skill that made him essential to the gang's criminal activities and too valuable for Tsotsi to discard. The novel goes on to describe that when Tsotsi thought of himself inwardly, there was only darkness. Even in his sleep, he never dreamed. It's almost as if his subconscious was also consumed by the same dark emptiness. This did not bother him, provided he remained living in the present moment and according to a set of tried and tested rules. His first rule was to check his knife every morning when he woke up. He would test its sharpness by shaving off a thin wafer of skin, and if he couldn't do this, he would sharpen it using a stone which he kept in his room. Tsotsi's second rule was to never disturb his inward darkness with the light. In other words, Tsotsi maintains the darkness within himself by refusing to confront or remember his past. However, sometimes this rule was not always in Tsotsi's total control. Sometimes something like the smell of wet newspaper would evoke a sense of something from his past. It was nothing that Tsotsi could really comprehend, but it would stir feelings of pain and mystery within him. The novel describes how he once saw a spider in the corner of the ceiling of his room. There was no explanation for it, but the spider caused Tsotsi to experience feelings of terror such that he could not sleep that particular night. The novel also explains a moment in time where an encounter with his past was more definitive. There was one particular day when Tsotsi, the Arp, and Butcher were rolling dice near the station. Butcher nudged Tsotsi when they saw a policeman walking past. In one hand he had a bicycle, and in the other hand he was dragging a man by the jacket. Butcher smiled and the Arp laughed, but Tsotsi just waited and watched. This man was young, perhaps Tsotsi's age, and he had clearly been beaten. Tsotsi was suddenly remembering the face, but in his memory it was of a boy. When this man looked at Tsotsi, his eyes lit up, and he called to Tsotsi, "David, it's me, Peter. David, help me." Tsotsi closed his ears, chose to hear no more, and instantly made himself forget about the incident, knowing it had something to do with his past. Tsotsi's third and final rule was an extension of the second. It was the rule that Boston had broken. Tsotsi tolerated no questions from another. It wasn't just that he did not know the answers, it went deeper than that. Questions from others triggered elements of his past that he did not want to face, making his past a tangible reality. The second and third rules would ensure that he remains invulnerable and is able to keep up his outward appearance of being hardened and unaffected by emotion. In order to maintain this existence of nothingness, Tsotsi exerted pain, fear, and death onto others. Back in the present moment, while Tsotsi is concealed within the grove of blue gum trees, he hears a noise and sees a scared young black woman in a long unbuttoned coat running down the street of the white suburb. She carries a shoebox with her, holding onto it very tightly. Tsotsi decides he is going to apprehend this young woman. As she enters the grove of trees, Tsotsi grabs her by the arm and pins her against a tree. He puts his hand over her mouth to stop her from screaming. The reader almost anticipates that Tsotsi is going to assault her, but suddenly she steps back and thrusts the shoebox into his hands and manages to run away. During this, the lid of the shoebox falls off. Tsotsi is so shocked with what is in the shoebox that he doesn't even try to chase the young woman as she runs off into the night. Tsotsi finds himself staring down into the wrinkled face of a tiny baby. Tsotsi's three rules serve as a psychological defense mechanism, allowing him to suppress his traumatic past and maintain the violent identity he has created for himself. The first rule is the rule of the waking moment. Before anything else, Tsotsi has to see his knife. Tsotsi's knife symbolizes his sense of purpose. It is something that is familiar to him, and it forms part of who he is as a gangster. The second rule is never to disturb the inward darkness with light, which is thoughts or memories of his past. If Tsotsi allows himself to think about who he really is, he risks losing the hardened gangster identity he has created. He cannot show vulnerability or emotion while maintaining this image of himself as a ruthless gangster. The third rule is that Tsotsi won't allow people to ask questions, because these questions could trigger aspects of his past that he does not want to face. These rules make us question why Tsotsi rejects vulnerability and relies on a facade of violence to maintain the identity he has created for himself. We are left wondering whether his violent persona is rooted in unresolved trauma from his past. The vague memory that is triggered by Peter, the man who recognizes Tsotsi and calls out for help, reveals to the reader that Tsotsi's real name is David. We also gather that Peter and Tsotsi must have grown up together as homeless children on the streets of the township. However, this is a memory that Tsotsi has pushed out of his mind. As Tsotsi runs away from the township and into the white suburbs, we start forming an image in our minds of the apartheid period in South Africa. Fugard mentions how the white suburbs are separated from the townships and how pristine and quiet they are. This contrasts sharply with the bustling, crowded, and chaotic atmosphere of the townships. Although the novel does not provide a reason for why the young woman abandons her baby, one possible interpretation is that she may have been in a relationship with a white man. If the baby was mixed race, the child could have been evidence of an interracial relationship, which was criminalized under apartheid laws. Her fear and desperation may therefore reflect the oppressive racial laws and social conditions of the time. Thank you for watching this presentation on Chapter 3 of Tsotsi by Athol Fugard. Keep an eye out for summaries and analyses of the rest of the novel.